In the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a mother's terrified scream pierced the afternoon air. 7-year-old Neil dangled precariously from the highest branch of the old oak, his small fingers slipping with each passing second. The townsfolk froze, watching in horror as lovely Mitchell reached helplessly toward her child. It was then that a shadow fell across the gathered crowd. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, the scarred Apache known only as Bear moved silently forward. The man the town whispered about, feared, and shunned without knowing. With powerful hands and surprising gentleness, he scaled the massive tree as if it were nothing more than a simple ladder. But could this single act of courage bridge 2 worlds separated by prejudice and pain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek's main street as lovely Mitchell unlocked the bakery door. Her fingers brushed against the silver locket at her throat. Inside, a small portrait of Thomas gone these past 3 years. Some mornings the weight of it felt heavier than others. "Just you and me again today, old friend," she whispered, the ritual as much a part of her mourning as the flower she'd soon dust across her apron. The scent of yeast and possibility filled the small bakery as Lovely worked the dough with practiced hands. At 38, her face carried the gentle lines of both laughter and worry, her auburn hair streaked with the occasional silver thread that she refused to hide. The women of Redemption Creek might gossip about the widow who wore her age plainly, but Lovely had stopped concerning herself with such matters. The day she'd buried her husband and picked up his dream of westward possibilities. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, announcing the arrival of her son. "Neil Mitchell, where have you been? I told you to fetch water, not disappear for half the morning." The 7-year-old's cheeks flushed with excitement rather than shame. "Ma, I was watching Miss Teeley shoe the new horses. He let me hold the nails." His small hands clutched a horseshoe nail that she knew would join his collection of treasures. Lovely's expression softened despite herself. "That doesn't change the fact that the water barrel is still empty, young man." Neil's shoulders slumped momentarily before rebounding with childish resilience. "I'll get it right now, Ma, but after, can I go play by the big tree? Jimmy says he can climb higher than anybody." "You'll do no such thing," Lovely said firmly, pointing toward the water barrel. "That old oak is not for climbing. Now water first, then you can help me with the cinnamon rolls." As Neil reluctantly dragged the bucket outside, Lovely caught her reflection in the small mirror behind the counter. Some days she hardly recognized the woman staring back, the determined set of her jaw so different from the carefree Philadelphia girl who had fallen in love with Thomas Mitchell's dreams of adventure. "Mrs. Mitchell, good morning." Sheriff Harlan Davis ducked his tall frame through the doorway, his customary frown softening slightly at the smell of fresh bread. "3 loaves today, if you've got them." "Of course, Sheriff." Lovely reached beneath the counter for the paper to wrap them. "Expecting company." New deputy arriving on Friday's stage. His eyes drifted toward the calendar on the wall. 2 years now, isn't it, since you and the boy arrived? 2 years next month, Lovely confirmed, carefully wrapping the still warm bread. "Getting on all right then? A woman alone?" The question trailed off, loaded with unspoken concerns. "We manage just fine," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "The bakery does well enough." Sheriff Davis nodded, something like respect flickering across his weathered features. "Town council's meeting tonight, discussing the Indian situation again." Lovely kept her expression neutral as she handed him the package. "I wasn't aware there was an Indian situation in Redemption Creek. That Apache giant living up near Cottonwood Spring," the sheriff said, lowering his voice though the shop was empty. "Makes folks nervous, him watching the town like he does." "I wasn't aware he'd caused any trouble," Lovely said carefully, accepting the coins the sheriff placed on the counter. "Hasn't yet." Sheriff Davis tucked the bread under his arm. "Just a matter of time with his kind. Seen what they can do firsthand in 58. Not a pretty sight. The bell jingled again as Neil struggled through the door with the water bucket, sloshing precious drops onto the wooden floor. "Careful there, young man," the sheriff said, ruffling Neil's sandy hair. "You're the man of the house now. Got to take care of your mother." After the sheriff left, Neil looked up at Lovely with serious eyes. "Ma, is that big Indian man dangerous like the sheriff says?" Lovely hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think people fear what they don't understand, Neil, and fear makes for poor judgment." "Jimmy's pa says he's a savage," Neil persisted. "That's enough," Lovely said firmly. "We don't use such words in this house. Now wash up and help me with these rolls." Later, as the afternoon lull settled over the bakery, Lovely found herself staring out the window toward the distant hills where the man they called Bear made his solitary home. She'd glimpsed him only a handful of times in town, his towering figure moving silently through the street, trading pelts or herbs with the few merchants willing to do business with him, his scarred face never meeting anyone's gaze directly. There was a dignity in his isolation that spoke to something within her, the part that understood what it meant to live among people while still standing apart. The silver locket seemed suddenly heavy against her skin. Thomas would have had strong words about her, even thinking about the Apache with anything but fear. But Thomas was gone, and Lovely had learned that survival sometimes meant questioning everything you'd once believed without question. Outside, Neil's laughter mingled with the shouts of the other children as they played in the street. Blissfully unaware of the invisible boundaries adults drew around their lives. Lovely touched the locket once more, then tucked it beneath her collar as she turned back to her work. Dawn found Markia, known to the white settlers as Bear, kneeling beside Cottonwood Spring, his massive frame perfectly still as he watched a deer and her fawn drink from the clear water. Neither animal startled at his presence. They had long ago learned that this human moved through the world differently than others. Beside him lay a weathered cavalry knife, its handle wrapped in rawhide darkened by years of use. The weapon was both tool and memory, a relic of a time when he had walked between two worlds and found welcome in neither. Markia dipped his hands into the cool spring and brought the water to his face, washing away the night's dreams. At 45, his body remained powerful despite the scars that mapped his history across his copper skin. The most prominent ran from his left temple down his cheek, a souvenir from the first time white men had decided he didn't belong among them. The small cabin he called home stood 100 yards away, built by his own hands where the wooded foothills met the valley. From his porch he could see Redemption Creek spread out below, the morning smoke from breakfast fires now rising into the clear sky. Inside the cabin, order prevailed, each tool hanging in its proper place, the floor swept clean, the single bed precisely made. Markia had learned discipline from both his peoples and found it one of the few gifts he could accept from either world. He built a small fire and prepared tea from herbs gathered the previous day. The ritual centered him, preparing his mind for the day's work. A half-finished cradle board stood in the corner, commissioned by Thompson, the aging town physician, who remained one of the few settlers willing to acknowledge Markia's skills openly. The doctor valued the traditional medicines Markia provided, though he called them folk remedies to his patients. It was a compromise that allowed healing to flow where pride and prejudice might otherwise block it. Markia stepped onto his porch, scanning the valley with eyes that missed little. The town was stirring now, the stage arriving, children gathering for school, the blacksmith's hammer already ringing in the clear morning air. He spotted the Mitchell boy helping his mother carry something into the bakery. The woman, Lovely, he had heard her called, moved with a quiet purpose that had caught his attention over the past month. Unlike the other white women, she did not cross the street when he approached, nor did she pull her child closer in fear. Instead, she merely nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly without judgment or expectation. Such small dignities were rare enough to be remembered. Markia returned to his work, his large hands surprisingly deft as they crafted a handle for a new hunting knife. The steady rhythm of creation settled his thoughts as morning gave way to afternoon. A flicker of movement in the distance drew his attention. The Mitchell boy again, now playing with other children near the massive oak at the edge of town. Makia frowned, setting aside his work to watch more closely. The ancient tree had stood for generations, its lower branches thick enough for climbing, but its upper reaches dangerously brittle. He had seen how the boy watched the older children climb, his face alight with the desire to prove himself. It was a look Makia recognized, the same expression he had worn as a 12-year-old, determined to complete his first hunting trial, desperate to be counted among the men. Such determination often walked hand in hand with danger. A memory surfaced unbidden, his mother's voice, soft but certain. "You carry the responsibility of sight. If you see trouble coming and do nothing, its weight is yours to bear." She had been gone 30 years now, taken by the same fever that claimed his father, leaving him caught between the Apache world of his mother and the white world that had sired him but never claimed him. Makia rose, decision made. He would move closer to town, watch the old oak, ensure the boy's safety from a distance. The settlers might fear his presence, but their discomfort weighed less than a child's safety. He secured his knife at his belt and gathered a few herbs for Thompson, a reason to approach town that even Sheriff Davis could not question. The pouch of medicinal plants hung from his belt opposite the cavalry knife, balance in all things, as his mother had taught him. As he descended the trail toward Redemption Creek, Makia caught sight of his reflection in a still pool of rainwater. The face that looked back remained as it always had, neither fully Apache nor white, belonging completely to neither world but irrevocably shaped by both. He continued downward, moving with the silent grace that had earned him his name among both peoples. Bare, powerful, solitary, respected from a distance but rarely welcomed close. Sheriff Harlan Davis stood on the jailhouse porch, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, watching Redemption Creek with the vigilance of a man who'd buried too many friends to complacence. 20 years wearing the badge had etched permanent lines around his eyes, not from laughter but from squinting into distant horizons, searching for trouble before it arrived. On his desk inside lay an old Winchester rifle, its stock polished smooth by years of handling. The weapon had accompanied him through the Apache campaigns of '58, when he'd lost his younger brother to an ambush that still haunted his dreams. The rifle served as both protection and reminder. Never trust too easily. Never let down your guard. "Morning, Sheriff," called Samuel Porter, the bank manager, tipping his hat as he passed. "Beautiful day," Davis nodded curtly. At 53, he had little patience for pleasantries. Beauty was a luxury afforded to those who hadn't seen its opposite up close. His gaze drifted toward the distant figure of the Apache, moving along the edge of town. Even from this distance, the man's size was imposing. A full head taller than most, shoulders like a draft horse. Davis felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinctive reach toward his sidearm. "He's just bringing herbs to Doc Thompson," said Deputy Collins, stepping onto the porch with a steaming coffee cup. "Does it every week?" "Don't much care what he's bringing," Davis replied. "I care that he's bringing anything at all. Town was peaceful before he settled up at Cottonwood." "Been here 3 years without incident," Collins ventured. At 26, the deputy still possessed the optimism Davis worked daily to discourage. "Doc says he's educated too. Speaks better English than half the town." "A wolf in gentleman's clothing is still a wolf," Davis said flatly. "You weren't there in '58. "I was." The conversation ended as Davis spotted Lovely Mitchell sweeping the boardwalk in front of her bakery. Something in her independent spirit both impressed and irritated him. A woman should know her place, especially a widow with a young son to raise. "Miss Mitchell seems to be managing well," Collins remarked, following his gaze. "For now," Davis conceded grudgingly. "Though that boy of hers needs a firmer hand. Caught him throwing rocks at Peterson's chickens yesterday." "Boys will be boys," Collins chuckled. "Boys become men," Davis countered. "What they learn as boys shapes what kind of men they'll be. That's why I don't like seeing that Apache hanging around where children might get ideas he's just another settler." Down the street, the stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust, bringing the weekly mail and whatever newcomers might be seeking opportunity in Redemption Creek. Founded just 12 years ago after the war, the town had grown steadily, new families arriving each month, drawn by promises of land and fresh beginnings. Davis watched as Jeremiah Whitman, the town's founder and mayor, greeted the stage passengers with expansive gestures. Whitman had named the town himself, preaching second chances to anyone who'd listen while quietly acquiring the choicest properties for development. Mayors in fine form today, Collins observed. Elections coming, Davis replied dryly. Expect speeches about progress and prosperity until the votes are counted. The sheriff's attention shifted as he spotted Neil Mitchell breaking away from the other school children, darting toward the old oak tree that stood at the town's edge. The boy's fascination with the massive tree had not escaped Davis's notice. "That Mitchell boy's going to break his neck in that tree one day," he muttered, moving down the steps. "Best have a word with his mother." As Davis crossed the street, he noticed the Apache had also stopped, his attention similarly fixed on the children near the tree. Their gazes met briefly across the distance, the sheriff's cold with warning, the Apache's unreadable behind the scar that disfigured his face. A shout from the saloon interrupted the moment, two miners arguing over a card game, their voices rising with alcohol and accusation. Davis turned toward the disturbance with practiced resignation. Keeping order was a never-ending task, especially with the mine paying out well and liquor flowing freely. By the time he'd settled the miners' dispute, the Apache had disappeared back toward the hills, and Neil Mitchell had rejoined the other children walking to school. Davis made a mental note to speak with Lovely about her son's fascination with both the tree and the savage, who watched from the distance. Some dangers announced themselves with shouts and gunfire. Others arrived silently, cloaked in seemingly innocent curiosity. In Davis's experience, the latter proved far deadlier. In the end, the afternoon sun beat down on Redemption Creek, the bakery kitchen transformed into a furnace of productive heat. Lovely wiped perspiration from her brow with a flour-dusted forearm, surveying the day's final batch of sourdough. The Thursday rush always tested her endurance, miners buying extra bread before Friday paydays, households stocking up before the weekend. "Neil, I need those pine kindling bundles," she called, receiving no answer. The quiet registered slowly, that particular silence unique to a child's absence. "Neil?" She stepped into the front of the shop, finding only Mrs. Abernathy examining currant buns. "Have you seen my son?" "Saw him with the Pearson boys headed toward the schoolyard," Mrs. Abernathy replied. "Though school's been out an hour already." A brass bell hung by the door, a gift from Thomas when they'd first opened the Philadelphia bakery. Its cheerful ring had followed them west, a sound that still connected her to everything she'd lost and everything she'd built anew. Lovely touched it gently as she stepped onto the boardwalk, scanning the street for Neil's familiar form. Her heart quickened as distant shouts reached her, children's voices, not in play but alarm. Without conscious thought, she found herself running, skirts gathered, toward the massive oak that stood sentinel at the town's edge. A small crowd had already gathered, faces tilted upward. Following their gaze, Lovely's breath caught painfully in her chest. Neil clung to a branch near the top of the ancient tree, at least 40 feet above the ground. Even from this distance, she could see his small body trembling. "Neil," the word tore from her throat. The boy looked down, his face pale with fear. "Ma, I can't get down. The branch is breaking." As if punctuating his words, a sharp crack split the air. The limb beneath Neil dipped precariously, eliciting gasps from the onlookers. "Somebody do something." Lovely pushed through the crowd, desperate for action, for help, for anything but the helpless circle of spectators. "Can't climb that high," muttered Bill Pearson, the blacksmith. "Branches won't hold a man's weight." "What about a rope?" someone suggested. "He's too scared to grab it if we could even throw it that far," came the reply. The branch cracked again. Neil whimpered, his fingers white-knuckled on the increasingly unstable limb. "My baby," Lovely whispered, terror closing her throat. A murmur rippled through the crowd as it parted. Sheriff Davis arrived, taking in the situation with a grim assessment. "How long's he been up there?" "Just found him," someone answered. Branches giving way. Davis removed his hat, shielding his eyes as he studied the tree. Too high. We'd need a ladder twice as tall as any in town. A shadow fell across the gathering. Turning, Lovely found herself looking up at the towering figure of Bear. The Apache stood silently assessing the situation, his face impassive, despite the tense whispers his arrival provoked. "You." Lovely moved toward him, desperation overriding everything she'd ever been taught about proper distance from his kind. "Please, my son." Bear's dark eyes shifted from her to the tree, understanding immediate. Without a word, he removed his leather vest and knife, handing them to a startled bystander. "Now hold on." Sheriff Davis stepped forward, hand moving instinctively to his gun. "We don't need, there's no time." Lovely interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that silenced even the sheriff. She turned back to Bear, her eyes pleading. "Please." With a slight nod, Bear approached the tree. His movements possessed a fluid grace that belied his size as he began to climb, powerful arms and legs finding purchase where others would fail. The crowd watched in tense silence as he ascended rapidly, the massive trunk seeming almost delicate beneath his hands. When he reached the middle branches, the tree swayed slightly under his weight. "The branch is breaking," Neil cried, his voice thin with terror. "Be still," Bear called up, his deep voice carrying clearly. "I am coming." The sound of his voice, the first many had heard from him, created a ripple of surprise through the onlookers. Lovely watched, heart in her throat, as Bear navigated the increasingly narrow branches. When a limb cracked beneath his foot, several women gasped, but he recovered smoothly, continuing upward with methodical precision. Finally, he reached a position just below Neil. "Look at me," he instructed the boy calmly. "Not down. Only at me." Neil's terrified eyes fixed on Bear's face. "Good. Now reach your hand to mine. I will not let you fall." The branch, supporting Neil, gave another warning crack. The boy hesitated, frozen with fear. "Neil," Bear's voice remained steady. "Your mother is waiting. She needs you to be brave for just one moment." At the mention of his mother, Neil's resolve visibly strengthened. He extended a trembling hand just as the branch beneath him finally surrendered to gravity. A collective cry rose from the crowd as Neil began to fall, only to be caught in Bear's powerful grip, the man's other hand anchoring them securely to the trunk. "I have you," Bear said simply. Time stood suspended as Bear held Neil securely against him with one powerful arm. The crowd below remained breathlessly silent, all previous prejudices momentarily forgotten in the drama of the rescue. "Hold tight to my neck," Bear instructed, his voice calm despite their precarious position. Neil wrapped his small arms around the man's scarred neck, burying his face against the broad shoulder. With deliberate movements, Bear began their descent, testing each branch before committing his weight. The journey down seemed to take both an eternity and no time at all to those watching below. When Bear's feet finally touched solid ground, Lovely rushed forward, gathering Neil into her arms with a sob of relief. The boy clung to her, his small body trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Bear with eyes shining with tears. "Thank you." He nodded once, his expression remaining composed as he retrieved his vest and knife from the stunned bystander who had held them. Sheriff Davis stepped forward, his face a complex mix of reluctant gratitude and ingrained suspicion. "That was well done," he managed, the words clearly difficult for him. Before Bear could respond, Neil pulled back from his mother's embrace. "He wasn't scared at all, Ma." He climbed like he was part of the tree. A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement over, though many cast curious glances back at the unusual tableau. The widow, her son, and the Apache giant standing together in an unlikely circle. "You're bleeding," Lovely said suddenly, noticing a long scratch on Bear's forearm where bark had torn his skin during the rescue. Bear glanced at the wound dismissively. "It is nothing." "It most certainly is something," she countered, with the same authority she'd used to silence the sheriff earlier. Neil, Go to the bakery and fetch my medicine box from under the counter. The boy hesitated, looking between his mother and his rescuer with wide eyes. Go on now, she urged gently. I need to properly thank the man who saved your life. As Neil dashed away, Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. Miss Mitchell, I'm not sure that's appropriate. With all due respect, Sheriff. Lovely interrupted, her voice soft but firm. I believe I'm capable of deciding what's appropriate when it comes to expressing gratitude. Davis's jaw tightened, but he merely nodded stiffly before turning away, his duty done but his disapproval evident. In the awkward silence that followed, Bear studied Lovely with quiet assessment. Few white women would have spoken to the sheriff so directly, fewer still would stand publicly beside an Apache without discomfort. Your son has your courage, he offered finally. My son has more recklessness than sense at the moment, she replied with a rueful smile. But I'm grateful beyond words that you were here. They walked together toward the bakery, an odd pair that drew curious glances from everyone they passed. Lovely felt the weight of the town's eyes, but found she cared less than she might have expected. Neil met them at the bakery door, proudly holding aloft a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl, a wedding gift from Lovely's grandmother, repurposed to hold healing supplies in this frontier town where doctors were scarce and injuries common. Inside the bakery, away from prying eyes, Lovely indicated a chair at the small table where she sometimes took her midday meal. Bear sat with a natural dignity that made the humble setting seem suddenly inadequate. This might sting, she warned, dabbing a cloth in witch hazel to clean his wound. I have endured worse, he said simply. His arm beneath her fingers was solid muscle, the skin marked with old scars that spoke of a hard life. Lovely worked efficiently, conscious of the impropriety of touching him, but unwilling to provide anything less than proper care. You speak very well, she observed, then immediately flushed at the potential insult in her words. I understand, Bear interrupted gently. My father was a teacher before he came west. He taught me to read and write before I could hunt. Is he? Lovely let the question hang delicately. Both my parents died of fever when I was 12, Bear replied, his deep voice matter of fact. The Apache took me in because of my mother. Neil watched this exchange with fascination, edging closer until he stood directly beside Bear, examining the man's scarred face with unfiltered curiosity. Did that hurt? The boy asked, pointing to the prominent scar that ran down the left side of Bear's face. Neil, Lovely admonished, mortified, but Bear merely regarded the child seriously. Yes, but pain passes. The lesson remains. What lesson? Neil persisted, that some men fear difference more than rattlesnakes. Bear answered, his honesty unvarnished yet delivered without bitterness. As Lovely finished bandaging his arm with a clean strip of linen, the back door opened. Mrs. Abernathy entered, stopping short at the sight before her. Lovely Mitchell, tending to the Apache, their heads bent together in quiet conversation, came to check if everything was all right. The older woman stammered, words spreading about the rescue. Everything is fine, Mrs. Abernathy. Lovely replied, her hands steady as she secured the bandage. Thanks to Mr. She paused, realizing she had no proper name to call him. Makia, he offered quietly. But here, most call me Bear. 3 days after the rescue, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing unseasonable cold that penetrated the bakery's thin walls. Lovely woke before dawn to check the ovens, only to find Neil huddled under his blankets, his small face flushed with fever. Just a chill, she assured him, though worry gnawed at her as she felt the unnatural heat radiating from his skin. You'll stay in bed today. By noon, Neil's condition had worsened. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and the cough that had started as a minor irritation now racked his small frame. Lovely placed a cool cloth on his forehead, fighting her rising panic. I'll fetch Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Abernathy offered, hovering in the doorway of the small bedroom. The older woman had appointed herself unofficial town messenger since witnessing Bear's presence in the bakery, though her gossip had been tempered with genuine concern. Thompson arrived carrying his battered leather medical bag, its brass corners worn smooth from decades of similar house calls. The aging physician examined Neil with gentle efficiency, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Lung fever," he confirmed, closing his bag with a decisive snap. "I've seen 3 cases already this week. The Pearson girl and Cooper's youngest are fighting it too. Will he?" Lovely couldn't finish the question. "I'll give him what I can," Dr. Thompson said, measuring powder into a paper twist. "Mix this with honey water every 4 hours. Keep him warm but watch for excessive heat. If the fever spikes higher," he didn't need to elaborate. They both knew children could slip away with frightening speed. After the doctor left, Lovely sat beside Neil's bed, watching each labored breath. The bakery remained closed, bread forgotten. As darkness fell, bringing another round of ragged coughing, a soft knock sounded at the back door. Lovely opened it to find Bear standing in the rain, water streaming from his long hair. Without preamble, he asked, "The boy is ill?" "How did you, Dr. Thompson?" he explained simply. "He said the medicine he has may not be enough." In his hands, Bear held a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "These might help," he said, offering it to her. Lovely hesitated only a moment before stepping aside to let him enter. Propriety seemed a foolish concern when weighed against her son's life. Bear moved silently to Neil's bedside, his imposing frame making the small room seem even more cramped. He placed a large hand gently on the boy's forehead, his expression revealing nothing as he assessed the fever. "The sickness is deep in his chest," he said, unwrapping the oilcloth to reveal several packets of dried herbs and a small clay pot. "This will help him breathe easier." Lovely watched as Bear took a pinch of herbs from one packet, crushing them between his fingers before adding them to a cup of hot water. The sharp, clean scent of pine and something unfamiliar filled the room. "What is that?" she asked. "White sage, pine needle, and osha root," he replied. "My mother used it for winter sickness." "Dr. Thompson gave us medicine," Lovely said, though without conviction. Bear nodded respectfully. "The doctor's medicine is good. This works differently. Together they may do what either alone cannot." Neil stirred, his eyes opening to fix glassily on the large man beside his bed. "Bear," he whispered hoarsely. "Drink this," Bear instructed, his deep voice gentler than Lovely had yet heard it. To Lovely's surprise, Neil obeyed without protest, grimacing at the bitter taste, but taking several sips before falling back against his pillow. "Now this," Bear said, opening the clay pot to reveal a thick, pine-scented salve. On his chest and back, he demonstrated, spreading a small amount on his palm before gesturing for Lovely to continue. She followed his example, rubbing the warming salve across Neil's chest. Almost immediately, the boy's breathing seemed to ease slightly. "You will need to reapply every few hours," Bear instructed, "and the tea when he wakes." He rose to leave, but Lovely caught his arm. "Please," she said softly, "stay, at least until we know if it's helping." Something flickered in Bear's dark eyes, surprise perhaps. After a moment's consideration, he nodded once and settled onto the floor beside the bed, his back against the wall, legs crossed in front of him. Together they maintained their vigil through the night. Occasionally Bear would adjust the proportions of herbs in the tea or demonstrate how to properly apply the salve. Mostly they sat in silence, broken only by Neil's gradually easing breaths. Near dawn, Neil's fever broke. He fell into a deep, healing sleep, his breathing almost normal. Lovely found herself sagging with relief, exhaustion, claiming her as she dozed in her chair. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee. Neil still slept peacefully, his face no longer flushed with fever. Bear was gone, but a small wooden figure sat on the bedside table, a perfectly carved horse, its lines flowing with a sense of movement and life. Beneath it lay a folded note written in a surprisingly elegant hand. "For Neil, may it carry his dreams safely." Lovely found herself searching the edge of town each morning, her eyes drawn to the trail leading toward Cottonwood Spring. 2 weeks had passed since Neil's recovery, and though the boy spoke constantly of Bear, the man himself had not returned to town. "Do you think he's coming today?" Neil asked, clutching the wooden horse as they walked to the general store. The carved figure had become his constant companion, sleeping beside his pillow at night and riding in his pocket by day. "I don't know, sweetheart," Lovely answered honestly. "Mr. Bear has his own life to tend to." "But he left us firewood yesterday," Neil insisted. "I saw it stacked behind the bakery when I woke up." Lovely had seen it too, a neat pile of split logs that hadn't been there the evening before, just as she'd found freshly killed rabbits on her back step twice in the past week, and wild berries in a carefully woven basket. Inside Monroe's general store, she felt the conversation halt as she entered. Miss Pearson and Widow Jenkins exchanged meaningful glances before offering overly bright greetings. "Lovely, how fortunate to see you," Mrs. Pearson exclaimed. "We were just discussing the social after Sunday services. You will attend, won't you?" "I hadn't planned to," Lovely replied, scanning her shopping list. "Sundays are my only day to catch up on." "Oh, but you must," Widow Jenkins interrupted. "Sheriff Davis's nephew is arriving from Denver, a lawyer and unmarried. Quite handsome, they say." The women's intentions were transparent. Lovely focused on selecting a bolt of cotton fabric, pretending not to notice their eager expressions. "How thoughtful," she murmured. "But Neil and I have our routine." Mr. Monroe placed a jar of molasses on the counter, his usually friendly face carefully neutral. "Mrs. Mitchell, might I have a word in private?" The storekeeper led her to his small office, closing the door before speaking. "I value your business," he began awkwardly, "and I've always found you to be a respectable woman." On his desk sat a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with careful columns of names and figures. This record of credit extended and debts paid represented the lifeblood of the town's economy, and a merchant's judgment of a customer's character. "Mr. Monroe," Lovely said, straightening her spine, "please speak plainly." He sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them nervously. "There's talk about associations that might not be in your best interest, or Neil's." "I assume you mean Bear," she said, using the name deliberately. "The Apache, yes." Monroe nodded. "Folks are concerned. He's been seen near your property at odd hours." "He saved my son's life," Lovely replied evenly, "and helped nurse him through lung fever when others feared contagion. No one disputes his actions were helpful," Monroe conceded, "but continued involvement with such a man raises questions about judgment." "My judgment? People wonder why he's providing for you," Monroe said, dropping his voice. "Leaving food and firewood like something more than neighborly concern." Heat rose in Lovely's cheeks, partly indignation, partly because the question had occurred to her as well during sleepless nights. Why was Bear silently providing for them? And why did the thought of his powerful hands splitting wood for her hearth create such a complicated warmth in her chest? "My accounts are current, Mr. Monroe," she said firmly. "If that changes, we can discuss my associations then." Outside the store, Neil tugged at her hand. "Ma, look, it's Bear." Across the street, the tall figure stood in conversation with Dr. Thompson. Even at this distance, his presence commanded attention, not just for his height and breadth, but for the quiet dignity in his bearing. As if sensing her gaze, Bear looked up. Their eyes met briefly before he nodded in acknowledgement and turned back to the doctor. "Can we go say hello?" Neil pleaded. "I want to show him I'm better." Conscious of watching eyes from the store window, Lovely hesitated. Then, making her decision, she squeezed Neil's hand. "Yes, let's thank him properly." As they crossed the street, Sheriff Davis emerged from the jailhouse, his gaze narrowing at the tableau forming before him, the widow and her son approaching the Apache. "Mrs. Mitchell," he called, intercepting them. "A moment of your time." "Perhaps later, Sheriff," she replied without stopping. "We have an important matter to attend to." Davis stepped directly into her path. "This is precisely what I need to discuss with you." His voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "People are talking, Lovely. This isn't Philadelphia. Out here, reputations are all a woman has." Then I'll thank you to step aside and allow me to preserve mine by properly expressing gratitude to the man who saved my son, she replied, loud enough for passers-by to hear. The sheriff's face flushed, but he moved reluctantly aside. Lovely continued forward, her heart pounding with a defiance that surprised her. Each step felt momentous, as though she was crossing more than just a dusty street. When they reached Bear and the doctor, Neil immediately held up his wooden horse. Look, I named him Thunder. Bear's stern features softened slightly. A good name for a strong horse. We wanted to thank you, Lovely said, finding her voice steadier than she expected, for everything. The firewood, the game, you knew it was me, Bear observed, neither confirming nor denying. Who else would it be? She asked with a small smile. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that needed no words. Dr. Thompson cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. I was just telling Bear that his OSHA route saved more than just Neil, the doctor said. The Pearson girl recovered after I tried his remedy. The credit belongs to the plants, not to me, Bear replied. They give their medicine to those who ask properly. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered, watching the conversation with undisguised interest. Lovely knew tomorrow would bring fresh gossip, but standing here in the sunlight, meeting Bear's dark eyes, she found she cared less than she might have expected. Sunday morning dawned, clear and bright, the church bell echoing across Redemption Creek with its weekly summons. Lovely helped Neil with his collar, smoothing down his stubborn cowlick with a damp hand. Do I have to go? He asked, fidgeting under her ministrations. Bear doesn't go to church. Bear has his own ways of honoring the Creator. Lovely replied, choosing her words carefully, and we have ours. Besides, you enjoy singing with Mrs. Thompson. In truth, Lovely's own enthusiasm for services had waned in recent weeks. The sermon topic seemed increasingly pointed, with Reverend Walsh expounding on proper associations and the dangers of straying from community standards. As they walked toward the white clapboard building, Lovely noticed unusual activity around the jailhouse. Several men clustered near the door, their expressions animated with excitement. What's happening? She asked Mrs. Abernathy, who hurried to intercept them before they reached the church steps. Oh, my dear, the older woman fretted. There's been a robbery. Miss Peterson's strongbox, taken right from under his bed, while they attended the Founders' Day committee meeting last night. How dreadful, Lovely replied. Was anyone hurt? No, thank heavens, but it contained the mine payroll he was holding for distribution on Monday. Nearly $500. Neil tugged at Lovely's skirt. Can we go see? Church first, Lovely said firmly, guiding him toward the steps where other children gathered. Inside, the usual pre-service conversations had been replaced by animated discussions of the theft. Lovely slipped into a pew near the back, nodding politely to those who acknowledged her while noting how several women deliberately turned away. Halfway through Reverend Walsh's unusually brief sermon, the church door opened. Sheriff Davis stepped inside, removing his hat with a murmured apology for the interruption. He scanned the congregation before his eyes settled on Lovely. A prickle of unease traveled down her spine. After the final hymn, Davis approached as she collected Neil. Miss Mitchell, might I have a word? Of course, Sheriff, she replied, noting the unusual formality in his address. Privately, he added, with a meaningful glance at the curious onlookers gathering within earshot. Outside, Davis led her a short distance from the church, his expression grave. I need to ask about your friend. Bear? She asked, immediately alert to his tone. Davis nodded, removing a folded paper from his vest pocket. The wanted notice bore no image, but the description was unmistakable. Apache male, approximately 45 years, unusual height, over 6 feet. Wanted for questioning in connection with theft of Peterson mine payroll. This is absurd, Lovely said, her voice sharper than she intended. Bear wouldn't steal. Perhaps not, Davis conceded, surprising her. But I need to question him. Peterson insists he saw someone of his description near their property yesterday evening. Many men have scars, Lovely countered, and there are trappers who come through. Mrs. Mitchell, Davis interrupted. I understand your gratitude toward him, but my duty is to investigate all possibilities. If he's innocent, he has nothing to fear. The memory of Bear's words about his scar surfaced in her mind. Some men fear difference more than rattlesnakes. Lovely knew exactly how much a man like Bear had to fear from even a simple questioning. When did this theft occur? She asked carefully. Between 7 and 9 last evening, best we can determine. Lovely felt a surge of relief. Then Bear is innocent. He was delivering firewood to the church meeting house during those hours. Reverend Walsh asked for volunteers yesterday. Davis's eyebrows rose. Walsh didn't mention that. Perhaps you should ask him, Lovely suggested, her voice steady despite her racing heart. And Mr. Peterson might reconsider what he believes he saw. As they spoke, a commotion erupted from the direction of the general store. Running footsteps approached, and young Jimmy Pearson skidded to a halt before them, his Sunday clothes disheveled. Sheriff, Pierre says come quick, the boy gasped. They caught somebody trying to sell Mr. Peterson's pocket watch in the saloon. Davis's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Some drifter, Jimmy panted. Says he just rode in yesterday. The sheriff cast a final, measuring look at Lovely before hurrying toward the saloon, leaving her standing alone with the wanted notice still clutched in her hand. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers. She stared at the crude description, understanding with sudden clarity how easily suspicion could destroy a man who already lived on society's margins. The wanted notice represented more than just a false accusation. It embodied the town's readiness to blame Bear for any misfortune, their need for his otherness to be synonymous with threat. With deliberate movements, Lovely folded the paper and placed it in her pocket. She would show it to Bear, not as a warning to hide, but as evidence of what they faced if their growing connection continued. Neil ran up, breathless with excitement. Mayor, they caught a robber. Can we go see? No, she replied, taking his hand firmly. But I think we should visit Bear this afternoon, to warn. She caught herself, to thank him again for his kindness. Really? You mean it? Neil's face lit up with joy. As they walked home, Lovely felt the weight of stares following them. The simple decision to visit Bear openly rather than warning him secretly felt like a declaration, one whose full implications she was only beginning to understand. The path to Cottonwood Spring wound through stands of aspen, whose leaves fluttered like golden coins in the afternoon breeze. Lovely had prepared a basket of fresh bread and apple preserves, a pretense for their visit, though the real purpose weighed in her pocket, where the wanted notice remained folded. Are we almost there? Neil asked for the third time, his shorter legs working double time to keep pace. Just around this bend, I believe, Lovely replied, though in truth she wasn't certain. She'd only heard descriptions of Bear's cabin, never having ventured this far from town before. The path opened suddenly into a small clearing where a neat cabin stood beside a bubbling spring. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a series of wooden racks held drying herbs and meat. Everything spoke of careful order and purpose. Bear emerged before they reached the door, his expression revealing momentary surprise before settling back into its customary calm. He wore a simple cotton shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, revealing powerful forearms marked with old scars. Lovely, Neil. He nodded to each of them. You've come a long way. We brought bread, Neil announced, darting forward with childish confidence. Ma made it special, with honey. Bear accepted the basket with formal courtesy. Thank you. Would you like to come inside? The cabin's interior surprised Lovely. She had expected something primitive, but the single room was meticulously organized. A small bookshelf held perhaps 24 well-worn volumes. A handcrafted table and chairs occupied one corner, while a neatly made bed stood against the far wall. Herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, filling the space with a complex, earthy fragrance. You read, she observed, then immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. When there is light, he replied, placing the basket on the table. Please, sit. Neil immediately began exploring, his curiosity drawn to a rack of antlers mounted on one wall. "What are these for?" "For making handles, tools," Bear explained. "Everything has purpose." While Neil examined the various implements hanging from pegs, Lovely reached into her pocket and withdrew the wanted notice. "This was posted in town," she said quietly, passing it to Bear. "You should know." He studied it, without visible reaction. "The sheriff believes I am a thief. They caught the real culprit, a drifter," she explained. "But I thought you should know how quickly suspicion fell on you." Bear folded the paper carefully. "It is not the first time. It will not be the last." His matter-of-fact acceptance pained her more than anger would have. "It isn't right," she said. "Few things are in this world," he replied. "But some are worth the difficulty." His dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her look away. To cover her sudden confusion, Lovely moved to examine the bookshelf. Among expected practical titles about plants and tracking, she found something surprising: a leather-bound copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. Its spine cracked from frequent reading. A pressed wildflower marked a page. "This seems unlike your other books," she observed, touching its worn cover. "My father's," Bear said. "He read them to my mother. She did not understand all the words, but she said they sounded like water over stones." Lovely opened to the marked page, reading the first lines aloud. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." She stopped, suddenly self-conscious, but Bear continued from memory. "Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date." The educated richness of his voice, speaking the familiar words, created a strange intimacy in the small cabin. Lovely closed the book carefully, returning it to its place. "You surprise me," she admitted. "As you surprise me," he countered. "Most would have brought the sheriff, not bread." Neil's voice interrupted their exchange. "Bear, what's this?" He pointed to a curious instrument hanging on the wall, a wooden flute decorated with intricate carvings. "A cedar flute," Bear replied, "for making music." "Will you play it?" Neil asked eagerly. Bear hesitated, looking to Lovely as if seeking permission. She nodded encouragement, curious herself. With careful movements, Bear lifted the flute from its pegs. He sat on a bench near the hearth, his large hands cradling the instrument with unexpected delicacy. After a moment's preparation, he began to play. The melody that emerged was unlike anything Lovely had heard before, haunting and somehow ancient, seeming to carry the voice of the wind through pine forests and across open plains. The simple tune spoke of loneliness and endurance in a language that required no word. Neil sat transfixed, his usual restlessness completely stilled. Lovely found herself equally affected, a tightness forming in her throat as the music filled the small cabin. When the last note faded, silence held them for several heartbeats. "That was beautiful," Lovely said finally. "What is it called?" "It has no name in English," Bear replied, "but it speaks of returning light after long darkness." Their eyes met again, and this time Lovely did not look away. Something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been forming since the day he had climbed the tree to save her son. "Could you teach me to play?" Neil asked, breaking the moment. "Perhaps," Bear said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "But first, would you like to see the eagle's nest on the ridge? They have young ones now." Neil's enthusiastic response made both adults smile. As they prepared to walk to the ridge, Lovely noticed Bear carefully return the flute to its place of honor on the wall. The simple cedar instrument had revealed more about the man than hours of conversation might have. The depth of his connection, his heritage, his capacity for beauty, the soul that existed behind his reserved exterior. The visits to Bear's cabin became a Sunday ritual over the following weeks. After church services, Lovely and Neil would make the journey up the winding path, bringing bread or pies and returning with knowledge of plants, tracks, or stars. Today they arrived to find Bear skinning a deer, his movements precise and respectful. Neil watched with fascination rather than squeamishness, absorbing Bear's quiet explanations about using every part of the animal and offering thanks for its sacrifice. "Can I try?" the boy asked, eyeing the small knife Bear used for finer work. Lovely opened her mouth to object, but Bear spoke first. "Yes, but with care and purpose. This is not play." To her surprise, Bear produced a child-sized knife from his pocket, a small blade with a carved antler handle, its edge dulled to prevent serious injury, but sharp enough for simple tasks. "I made this," he said, offering it to Neil, "for learning." Neil accepted the gift with wide eyes, holding it reverently. "My own knife, really? A knife is responsibility," Bear explained solemnly. "It can harm or help. The choice belongs to the one who holds it." "I'll be careful," Neil promised, his expression serious beyond his years. Bear nodded, then guided Neil's small hands through the motions of preparing a strip of hide for tanning, showing him how to hold the knife safely and work with the grain. Watching them together, Lovely felt a complex emotion rise in her chest, gratitude mixed with a bittersweet awareness of what Neil had missed without a father. Bear spoke to him, not as a child, but as a person worthy of real knowledge, capable of growth and understanding. Later, while Neil practiced his new skills on a scrap of leather, Bear and Lovely sat on the cabin's small porch, drinking tea brewed from wild mint. The comfortable silence between them had become familiar, a shared language of its own. "Neil needs these things you're teaching him," Lovely said finally. "Things I cannot." Bear's dark eyes studied the distance. "He learns quickly, listens well. He adores you," she said simply. Something flickered across Bear's scarred face, pleasure perhaps, or uncertainty. "He needs a man to show him the way of things," he said carefully. "It is natural. Thomas would have," Lovely began, then stopped. "No, that's not true. Thomas was often impatient with childish questions. He valued achievement, not curiosity." Bear considered this. Different men, different teachings, all have value. "Not all," Lovely said, thinking of her late husband's rigid judgments. "Thomas would never have accepted." She gestured vaguely at the space between them, unable to name what had grown there. "Me," Bear finished simply. "No," she admitted. "He held strong views about proper society." Bear nodded, unsurprised. "Many do." From inside the cabin they heard Neil exclaim with delight, having successfully cut his first leather strip. The sound drew a rare smile from Bear, softening his features. "You understand children," Lovely observed. "Did you have any of your own?" The question crossed an unspoken boundary between them. Bear was silent for so long that Lovely thought he might not answer. "There was a woman," he said finally, his deep voice lower than usual. "Many years ago, she was Charakawa, from my mother's people. We were to be married when I returned from scouting for the army." He fell silent again, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "What happened?" Lovely asked gently. Bear reached beneath his shirt and withdrew a silver concho pendant, hanging from a leather cord around his neck. The round silver piece was beautifully crafted, with intricate stampwork surrounding a turquoise stone. "I made this for her," he said, holding it in his palm. "As a promise, when I returned from the campaign, her village had been attacked by settlers, claiming their land. She and her family were gone." "I'm so sorry," Lovely whispered. "I wear it to remember that promises outlive those who make them," Bear said, tucking the pendant back beneath his shirt. "And that loss is the one thing all people share, regardless of their origin." The simple dignity in his words moved her deeply. Without thinking, Lovely reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them. His skin felt warm and weathered beneath her fingers. Bear looked down at their hands, then slowly turned his palm upward, his large fingers curling gently around hers. The gesture contained both question and answer. Inside the cabin, Neil called out, "Ma!" "Bear, look what I made." They separated naturally as the boy appeared in the doorway, proudly holding up a crudely cut piece of leather. "Bear says I can make a pouch with it." "That's wonderful," Lovely said, her voice slightly unsteady. "You'll have to show Mrs. Abernathy your new skill." Neil's face fell slightly. She won't like that I have a knife. She says I'm too little. Then perhaps it can be our secret for now, Bear suggested. Some knowledge is for sharing, some for keeping. Like how you and Ma hold hands when you think I'm not looking. Neil asked innocently. Lovely felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Bear merely nodded seriously. Yes, like that. As the afternoon light began to fade, signaling time for their departure, Neil asked the question he posed at the end of every visit. Can't Bear come back with us, Ma? Just for supper? Each time before, Lovely had gently refused, citing propriety and the lateness of the hour. Today she found herself considering it seriously. The town would talk, of course, but they already did. Would you like to join us? She asked Bear, surprising herself with the invitation. It's nothing fancy, just rabbit stew. The look that passed between them held more meaning than the simple question warranted. They both understood what she was really asking. Yes, Bear said simply. I would like that very much. The stage arrived on Thursday afternoon, bringing the usual assortment of mail, supplies, and occasionally new faces to Redemption Creek. Lovely was arranging fresh loaves in the bakery window when the commotion outside drew her attention. A tall man in an expensive Eastern suit descended from the coach, his polished appearance immediately marking him as an outsider. Something in his bearing triggered a distant memory. When he turned toward the bakery, recognition struck like a physical blow. Victor Mitchell, Thomas's older brother. His appearance in Redemption Creek could mean nothing good. The small brass key in Lovely's apron pocket suddenly felt heavy. The key to the strongbox where she kept Thomas's will, their marriage certificate, and the deed to the bakery. Documents she hadn't examined in nearly 3 years, secure in the knowledge that her life here was established and stable. The bell above the door jingled as Victor entered, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. At 45, he retained the Mitchell family's handsome features, though cold ambition had hardened them in ways Thomas's face had never shown. Lovely, he greeted her, as though they had parted only yesterday rather than at Thomas's funeral 3 years prior. You're looking fronty. Victor, she replied, wiping flour from her hands. This is unexpected. His smile never reached his eyes. Family should stay connected, especially those sharing legal interests. The chill that ran through her had nothing to do with the autumn air. What legal interests might those be? Instead of answering, Victor glanced around the bakery. Quaint establishment. Profitable, I hope. And where is my nephew? Neil must be. What, 7 now? He's with a friend. Lovely replied carefully. Learning to fish. Victor set his hat on the counter, clearly planning to stay. With proper schooling, he could become something more than a country fisherman. Philadelphia Academy has an excellent reputation. Boys his age adapt quickly to boarding arrangements. The true purpose of his visit crystallized with terrifying clarity. Neil is my son, Victor. His education is my concern. Actually, my dear, Victor's voice took on the patronizing tone she remembered from Philadelphia society gatherings. Neil's welfare is a shared concern. Have you forgotten the terms of Thomas's will? She hadn't forgotten. The memory had simply been buried beneath years of building a new life. Thomas, always concerned with appearances and family connections, had included a provision that should Lovely remarry, guardianship of Neil would transfer to Victor to ensure the boy was raised with proper Mitchell values. I'm not remarried, Lovely stated flatly. No, but rumors of your associations have reached Philadelphia, Victor replied. Even there, people talk of the widow Mitchell and her Apache companion. The word companion carried insinuations that made her cheeks burn. You've traveled a long way based on gossip. Victor's smile tightened. I've traveled based on financial interests. Lovely. Thomas's investment in the Philadelphia Shipping Consortium has matured considerably. As Neil's guardian, I would naturally manage those funds until his majority. Of course, it had never been about Neil's welfare. The Mitchell family fortune had always been Victor's primary concern. You have no claim here, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Don't I? Victor reached into his jacket and withdrew an official-looking document bearing a judicial seal. This court order authorizes me to evaluate Neil's living situation and determine if the conditions of the will have been effectively triggered through your inappropriate relationships. Lovely stared at the document, fighting rising panic. That paper means nothing in this territory. Perhaps, Victor conceded, but a letter to the territorial judge explaining that a young boy's inheritance is being squandered while he's exposed to the influence of savages might prompt an investigation you'd rather avoid. The calculated threat hung in the air between them. Before Lovely could respond, the door opened again. Sheriff Davis entered, clearly having observed Victor's arrival. "Afternoon, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, then turned to Victor with professional assessment. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Mr. Mitchell." Victor Mitchell, brother of Thomas Mitchell, the lady's late husband. Victor extended his hand with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to authority. "I've come concerning my nephew's welfare." Davis's eyes flickered to Lovely, something unreadable in his expression. "Family business is important business," he observed neutrally. "Indeed," Victor agreed smoothly, "though sometimes family requires the support of local law enforcement to ensure proper arrangements are maintained." The implicit alliance being formed before her eyes filled Lovely with cold dread. Victor would naturally seek the sheriff's cooperation, and Davis's known disapproval of Bear made him a ready ally. "Sheriff," Lovely said carefully, "Mr. Mitchell's concerns are based on misunderstandings about my friendship with Mr. Macchia, who, as you know, saved Neil's life." Davis shifted uncomfortably. Bear's actions with the tree were commendable, but, the incident I've heard about," Victor interrupted. "One good deed hardly qualifies a man for continued influence over an impressionable child, especially a man of such background." The bigotry in Victor's tone was so casual, so assumed to be shared, that Lovely felt physically ill. Before she could respond, Neil burst through the door, his clothes damp from the creek, face alight with excitement. "Ma, look what Bear showed me how to catch," he exclaimed, holding up a string of trout. He stopped short at the sight of the unfamiliar man, his enthusiasm dimming with childish intuition that something was wrong. Victor's gaze fixed on Neil with calculating assessment. "Hello, Neil. I'm your Uncle Vic. We have a great deal to discuss about your future." The town hall's austere wooden benches had been arranged in rows facing the mayor's desk, transformed for the day into something resembling a courtroom. Lovely sat stiffly in the front row. Neil pressed against her side. The boy's Sunday suit, slightly too small after his recent growth, made him fidget uncomfortably. "Sit still," she whispered, though her own nerves threatened to betray her composed exterior. 3 days had passed since Victor's arrival, days in which he had efficiently ingratiated himself with Redemption Creek's leading citizens. His Eastern refinement and Mitchell family connections had opened doors that might have remained closed to others. Now, Mayor Whitman had agreed to hold what he called an informal community inquiry into Neil's guardianship. Informal, perhaps, but the territorial judge's seal on the document lying open on the mayor's desk gave the proceedings an ominous weight of authority. The embossed judicial seal caught the light as Mayor Whitman adjusted the lamp, an official validation of outside authority reaching into their lives. The room filled quickly. Lovely felt the pressure of stares against her back, heard the whispers barely concealed behind hands. News of Victor's claims had spread through town with the efficiency of a summer wildfire. "All rise," announced Deputy Collins, clearly enjoying his elevated role in the proceedings. Mayor Whitman entered, followed by Sheriff Davis and Reverend Walsh, the 3 men comprising what Victor had termed a committee of community standards. Victor himself entered last, immaculately dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most miners earned in 6 months. "Be seated," Whitman intoned, his shopkeeper's voice straining for judicial gravity. "We're gathered to consider matters regarding the guardianship of Neil Thomas Mitchell, currently in the care of his mother, Mrs. Lovely Mitchell." Lovely's hand found Neil's smaller one, squeezing gently. "Mr. Victor Mitchell, the boy's uncle, has raised concerns regarding proper guidance and influences," Whitman continued. As mayor, I've agreed to oversee this inquiry with the assistance of Sheriff Davis and Reverend Walsh to determine if action is warranted. Victor rose smoothly. Thank you, Mayor Whitman. I'll be brief. My late brother's will contains specific provisions regarding his son's upbringing. He produced a copy of the document. Should his widow enter into an inappropriate relationship or remarry unsuitably, guardianship would transfer to me to ensure Neil receives proper education and moral guidance. And you contend these conditions have been met? Whitman asked. I have reliable reports that Mrs. Mitchell has formed an improper association with the Apache man, known as Bear, Victor replied. While not technically remarriage, this relationship violates both the spirit of Thomas's wishes and the moral standards any boy requires in his formative years. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lovely forced herself to stare straight ahead, though she felt her cheeks burn. Mrs. Mitchell, Mayor Whitman said, do you wish to respond to these allegations? Lovely stood, her voice steadier than she expected. Mr. Makia, the man you call Dare, saved my son's life when no one else could. He later helped nurse him through lung fever. Her friendship grew from gratitude. And yes, he has taught Neil valuable skills. There is nothing improper in our association. Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. Miss Mitchell, several citizens have reported seeing the Apache at your home at inappropriate hours. He has joined us for meals, Lovely replied evenly. Always with my son present. Victor stepped forward. The issue isn't merely propriety, but influence. This man represents values and ways contrary to how Thomas wanted his son raised. The Mitchell family has standards. Standards? Lovely interrupted, her composure cracking. Bear has taught Neil responsibility, respect for nature, and the value of knowledge. What exactly do you object to in those lessons? Please maintain order, Mayor Whitman cautioned. Reverend Walsh, you wished to speak. The Reverend stood, Bible in hand, though he didn't open it. The spiritual development of the child must be considered. Exposure to pagan influences. Bear has never interfered with Neil's church attendance. Lovely countered. Nevertheless, Walsh continued, a boy needs Christian guidance from a proper male figure. Scripture is clear on the ordering of the family. Neil tugged at Lovely's sleeve. Mayor, why are they talking about Bear like he's bad? He's not bad. I know, sweetheart, she whispered. Victor seized on the exchange. The boy clearly shows attachment to this man, an attachment that undermines proper family loyalty and heritage. Neil, son, he said, addressing the boy directly, wouldn't you like to come to Philadelphia? There are fine schools, other boys of good family to befriend. You could become a proper Mitchell. Before Lovely could intervene, Neil stood up, his small face set with determination. I don't want to go to Philadelphia. I want to stay with Ma and learn from Bear. He's teaching me to be a man, like he is. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Victor's expression hardened. You see, the savage's influence is already evident. That's enough. Lovely's voice cut through the murmurs. My son is not a piece of property to be claimed for financial advantage. Financial advantage? Mayor Whitman's eyebrows rose. Lovely seized the opening. Why don't you tell them about the Mitchell shipping investments, Victor? The ones you'd control as Neil's guardian. A flicker of surprise crossed Victor's face before his mask of concern returned. My brother's investments are indeed substantial, which is precisely why proper management is essential for Neil's future. Thompson, who had been sitting quietly at the back, rose to his feet. If I may, Mayor Whitman, I've observed Mrs. Mitchell's care of Neil since their arrival. The boy is healthy, well-mannered, and thriving. As for Bear, I've worked with him professionally. His knowledge of medicine has saved lives in this town, including Neil's. His character is beyond reproach. Thank you, Doctor, Whitman acknowledged. Sheriff Davis, your perspective. Davis shifted uncomfortably. The Apache has caused no trouble directly. The rescue at the tree was admirable. He paused. However, concerns about propriety are not unfounded. The proceedings continued with various townspeople offering opinions, some supporting Lovely, others expressing reservations about Bear's influence. Through it all, Neil remained pressed against her side, his earlier bravery now diminished by the adults arguing over his future. Finally, Mayor Whitman held up his hands. "I believe we've heard enough for today. This committee will deliberate and render a decision in 3 days' time. Until then, Neil remains with his mother, but he fixed Lovely with a stern gaze. There will be no contact with the Apache. Is that understood?" The territorial judge's seal on the document gleamed in the lamplight, a reminder of the official authority backing these informal proceedings. Lovely nodded stiffly, knowing that open defiance now would only strengthen Victor's case. As they left the town hall, Neil looked up at her with fearful eyes. "They can't take me away from you, can they, Ma?" Lovely pulled him close, unable to offer the absolute reassurance he sought. Over his head she caught sight of Victor watching them with the satisfied expression of a man who believed victory was merely a formality. "We're going to fight this," she promised Neil. "All of us." Dusk settled over Redemption Creek as Lovely slipped through the shadows behind the livery stable. The committee's order forbidding contact with Bear hadn't specified who might carry messages to him. Miss Abernathy, whose curiosity had finally overcome her prejudice, had agreed to watch Neil while Lovely ostensibly delivered a late order to the mining camp. Instead, she made her way to the small clearing where Bear waited, having received her hastily scrawled note through Doc Thompson earlier that day. He rose from his seated position against a pine tree as she approached, his expression betraying relief at her appearance. "I feared you might not come. The whole town is watching me," Lovely admitted. "But I had to see you." She quickly related the details of the hearing, Victor's claims, and the committee's temporary order. Bear listened without interruption, his face impassive though his eyes darkened at the mention of Neil's brave defense. "They've given us 3 days before making their decision," Lovely concluded. "Victor has already convinced half the town that you're a dangerous influence." "Perhaps I am," Fear said quietly. "My presence in your life has brought this trouble." "No," Lovely replied firmly. "Victor would have found another excuse. This is about Neil's inheritance, not about you." Bear moved closer, reaching into a leather pouch at his belt. "There may be a way to change some minds." He withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age and creased from frequent folding. Carefully, he handed it to Lovely. In the fading light, she could make out an official letterhead with the United States Army insignia. The military discharge paper bore the name Markia Williams and detailed honorable service as a scout with the 3rd Cavalry Regiment from a... "You served in the Army?" Lovely asked, surprised despite herself. 6 years, Bear confirmed. "After my time with my mother's people, I tried to find a place in the white world. The Army needed men who knew Apache ways and territory." Lovely studied the paper more carefully, noting the officer's comments praising Makia's exceptional service, bravery, and loyalty. "This could help. The committee would have to acknowledge your standing if they saw this." Bear's expression remained troubled. "I have not shown this paper to anyone in many years. Why not?" Lovely asked gently. His scarred face tightened with remembered pain. "I learned that such papers do not change what people see when they look at me, and using it feels like betrayal of my mother's people, who suffered at the hands of those I guided." Lovely understood the weight of what she was asking. "I wouldn't suggest it if Neil's future wasn't at stake." "I know," Bear said, his deep voice softening. "That is why I brought it." The discharge paper represented more than just military service. It embodied Bear's painful navigation between 2 worlds, neither of which had fully accepted him. Now he was willing to use this complicated piece of his past to help secure Neil's future. "There's more," Lovely said, her mind racing with plans. "Tomorrow is Founders' Day. The whole town will gather for the celebration. If we appear together openly, you, me, and Neil, it would show we have nothing to hide." "A public declaration," Bear observed. "Yes," Lovely admitted. "The committee has forbidden contact between you and Neil, but they said nothing about me seeing you. It's a risk. but hiding now only makes us look guilty of something improper. Bear considered this, his gaze drifting toward the lights of town. Victor would use such defiance against you. He'll twist anything to his advantage. Lovely replied, at least this way, we choose the battlefield. The military metaphor wasn't lost on Bear. A hint of a smile touched his lips. You would have made a good tactical officer. His approval warmed her more than it should have. Standing close in the growing darkness, Lovely was acutely aware of how much she had come to depend on his steady presence, his quiet strength. There's something else we should consider, she said, forcing herself to voice the thought that had been forming since the hearing. The will only transfers guardianship if I remarry unsuitably. It says nothing about suitable marriage. Bear went very still. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, Lovely replied carefully. Only that we should consider all possibilities. The weight of her words hung between them. They had never spoken directly of marriage, though their growing feelings had become increasingly evident to both. Such a step would need to be for the right reasons, Bear said finally. Not merely to counter Victor's claim. Of course, Lovely agreed, relieved he hadn't dismissed the idea outright. There's much to consider. And little time, Bear added. Their eyes met in the dimness, an unspoken current passing between them. Impulsively, Lovely reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. Tomorrow then, she said, Founders' Day, we'll come together as whatever we are becoming. Whatever we are becoming, Bear echoed. The simple phrase containing a universe of possibility. The distant church bell tolled the hour, reminding Lovely that her absence would soon be noticed. Reluctantly, she released his hand. I should go. Neil will be waiting. Bear nodded. Tell him, he hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. Tell him I keep my promises. Always. As Lovely made her way back toward town, the army discharge paper carefully folded in her pocket, she felt both trepidation and resolve. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. The town would see them together and judge. Victor would rage, and the committee would make its decision. Yet beneath her anxiety ran a current of something she hadn't felt in years. The certainty that she was fighting for something truly worth the risk. Founders' Day transformed the main street of Redemption Creek into a celebration of pioneer spirit. Red, white and blue bunting hung from every storefront, and the smell of barbecue and apple pies filled the air. A wooden platform had been erected outside the town hall for speeches and presentations, and children darted between knots of adults, faces sticky with candy. Lovely stood at her bedroom window, watching the festivities begin. She smoothed the front of her best dress, cornflower blue calico, with a lace collar she had saved for special occasions. Neil waited impatiently by the door in his Sunday suit, polished and presentable despite his fidgeting. Is Bear meeting us there? He asked, for the third time. Yes, Lovely replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. Remember what we discussed. Today we hold our heads high and show everyone that we have nothing to be ashamed of. Neil nodded solemnly. And I'm to be on my best behavior, so nobody can say bad things about how you raised me. His understanding of the stakes twisted something in Lovely's heart. No 7-year-old should have to shoulder such awareness. As they stepped outside, Lovely instinctively touched the silver locket at her throat, a habit in moments of uncertainty. Inside, alongside Thomas's portrait, she had tucked a small piece of paper with Bear's promise written in his elegant hand. I keep my promises, always. The crowd parted slightly as they made their way toward the celebration, conversations pausing and resuming in their wake. Lovely nodded politely to acquaintances, maintaining the dignity she had promised herself she would show today. Mayor Whitman stood on the platform, reading a proclamation about the town's founding, his voice carrying over the assembled citizens. Sheriff Davis and Reverend Walsh flanked him on either side, the same trio that would determine Neil's fate tomorrow. Victor Mitchell stood among the town's prominent citizens, impeccably dressed, and affecting the easy charm that had won over so many in such a short time. When he spotted Lovely and Neil, his smile hardened imperceptibly. "There's my favorite nephew," he called, approaching them with calculated warmth. "I've been telling everyone about the pony I have waiting for you in Philadelphia." Neil pressed closer Lovely's side. "I don't want a pony if it means leaving Ma," he said quietly. Victor's expression tightened. "Children should be seen and not heard on such matters," he said, then turned to Lovely. "I trust you've considered my proposal carefully. A private resolution would be less difficult for everyone." "We have nothing to discuss privately," Lovely replied even. A stir in the crowd drew their attention. People were turning, expressions registering surprise and, in some cases, alarm. Bear had arrived. He moved through the gathering with quiet dignity, dressed not in his usual buckskins, but in a clean white shirt and dark trousers that must have been carefully stored for rare occasions. His long hair was tied back neatly, and he wore no visible weapons, though his imposing size remained presence enough. Neil broke away from Lovely, running to Bear with unconcealed delight. "UK." Bear placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, the contrast between his massive scarred hand and Neil's small frame striking but somehow right. Together, they walked to where Lovely stood, forming a tableau that silenced conversations across the square. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Mitchell," Bear said formally, for the benefit of those watching. "Mr. Williams," she replied, using his surname deliberately. "Thank you for joining us." Victor's face darkened with anger. "This is outrageous." The committee specifically ordered that Neil have no contact with Bear, Lovely interrupted. "They said nothing about my associations, and I've invited Mr. Williams to join me for Founders Day." Sheriff Davis approached, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered gun. "Mrs. Mitchell, this provocation isn't helping your case." "There's no provocation, Sheriff," Lovely replied, "only a citizen attending a public celebration." Bear reached into his pocket and withdrew the folded discharge paper, offering it to Dave. "Perhaps this will clarify my standing in this community." Davis unfolded the document, his expression shifting from suspicion to surprise, as he read, "You served with the 3rd Cavalry." 6 years, Bear confirmed, under Captain James Ellison. "Ellison was a good man," Davis admitted reluctantly, "fought alongside him in '63. The tension ebbed slightly as Davis handed the paper to Mayor Whitman, who had descended from the platform at the first sign of disturbance. The mayor studied it with raised eyebrows. "This is unexpected," Whitman acknowledged. Victor stepped forward, his carefully cultivated charm giving way to open disdain. "A piece of paper doesn't change what he is. My brother would never have approved of this savage influencing his son." The slur hung in the air, its ugliness rendering even the town gossips momentarily silent. Bear's expression remained impassive, though Lovely felt him stiffen beside her. "That savage, as you call him, saved Neil's life," came a voice from the crowd. Miss Pearson stepped forward, her usual disapproving expression replaced by unexpected resolution. "And my Emma's too, with his medicines. He's always been fair in his trading," added Mr. Monroe, the shopkeeper who had once warned Lovely about her associations. "Pays his debts promptly." A few other voices joined in with similar observations, not enough to constitute majority support, but sufficient to demonstrate that Bear was not without defenders in Redemption Creek. Victor's face flushed with anger. "This doesn't change the fact the will is clear about unsuitable influences." "You mean the will you've been so eager to enforce?" Dr. Thompson interrupted, stepping forward with a folded newspaper in hand. "Perhaps we should discuss the real reason for your sudden concern with your nephew's welfare." The doctor unfolded the Philadelphia Business Journal, displaying a headline about the Mitchell Shipping Consortium's recent lucrative contract with the Union Pacific Railroad. "Interesting timing, your arrival just as your brother's investments have tripled in value." Victor's expression confirmed the accusation before he could compose himself. "That's completely irrelevant to the boy's moral well-being." "Is it?" Lovely challenged. "You've never shown interest in Neil before. Not a single letter in 3 years. Neil, who had been watching the adults with growing distress, suddenly spoke up. "I want to stay with Mai and Bear. They're my family now. His clear child's voice cut through the adult arguments with simple truth. A momentary silence fell over the gathering. Victor's face hardened into calculated resolve. This spectacle changes nothing legally. The committee will still rule tomorrow, and I have every confidence in their judgment. He turned to Sheriff Davis. In fact, given this public defiance of their order regarding the boy's contact with the Apache, perhaps they should consider immediate temporary custody arrangements. Sheriff Davis raised his hand, silencing the growing murmurs. This isn't the place for such discussion. The committee will meet as scheduled tomorrow. He turned to Lovely. Until then, I suggest you respect the spirit of our directive regarding the boy. The tension eased slightly as the mayor called for the continuation of the festivity. Musicians began tuning their instruments for the planned dancing, drawing attention away from the confrontation. Lovely exhaled slowly. That could have gone worse, she murmured to Bear. It isn't over, he replied quiet. Victor retreated to confer with Reverend Walsh, their heads bent in urgent conversation. The threat remained, merely postponed. Can we get some pie now? Neil asked, his child's priorities reasserting themselves now that the immediate conflict had passed. Of course, Lovely said, grateful for the normalcy of the request. Stay where I can see you. As Neil darted toward the dessert tables, Bear scanned the crowd with the alertness of a man accustomed to assessing threats. Victor will not surrender easily, he observed. Men driven by greed rarely do. At least some people spoke up for you, Lovely said. That's progress. The afternoon continued with forced normality. Lovely and Bear remained together, accepting both the occasional friendly greeting and the more frequent cold shoulders with equal composure. Neil returned with his pie, then joined other children playing tag near the schoolhouse, while remaining within view. Mayor Whitman took the stage again for his annual Founders' Day address, drawing the crowd's attention. Lovely used the opportunity to check on Neil, but the group of children had moved further away, partially obscured by wagons parked at the edge of the gathering. Do you see Neil? She asked Bear, a flutter of concern rising in her chest. Bear's height gave him advantage as he surveyed the scene. He was near the schoolhouse with the Pearson boy, he said, then frowned. I don't see him now. He's probably just behind the wagons, Lovely said, though unease had already taken root. Let's check. They moved quickly through the crowd, ignoring the curious glances their partnership attracted. The children's game had scattered the participants, but Neil was not among those still playing. Neil? Lovely called, her voice carrying the first edge of worry. Jimmy Pearson looked up from where he crouched, examining a lizard. He went with his uncle, the boy said casually. Said they was going to see something special. The world seemed to tilt beneath Lovely's feet. His uncle? When? Just now, Jimmy shrugged. During the mayor's boring speech, Bear's hand steadied Lovely as she swayed slightly. Which direction? He asked the boy, his voice calm despite the urgency in his eyes. Jimmy pointed toward the livery stable. That way. His uncle had horses ready. Without hesitation, Bear strode toward the stable, Lovely hurrying to keep pace with his longer strides. The stable boy confirmed what they already feared. Victor had collected 2 saddled horses 15 minutes earlier, saying he was taking his nephew for a short ride. He wouldn't, Lovely whispered, though she knew with sickening certainty that he would. He couldn't just take Neil. He's trying to force your concession, Bear said grimly, or create a situation where temporary custody seems necessary. They returned to the celebration, where Sheriff Davis was enjoying a plate of barbecue with other town officials. Victor has taken Neil, Lovely announced without preamble. Without my permission. Davis set down his plate, instantly alert. Are you certain? Perhaps he's just showing the boy. 2 horses, saddled for travel, Bear interrupted. The stable boy said Victor had supplies packed. A flicker of genuine concern crossed the sheriff's face. That's beyond what we discussed at the committee, he admitted. Where would he take the boy? The stage depot at Crystal Creek would be my guess, said Dr. Thompson, who had joined them. He could catch tomorrow's eastbound from there. Davis considered this. That's 15 miles. I'll form a search party. There's no time, Bear cut in. I can track them faster alone. Not alone, Lovely said firmly. I'm coming with you. Mrs. Mitchell, that's not advisable, Davis began. He's my son, she replied, brooking no argument. And I'm a better rider than most in this town. Thomas made sure of that. Bear was already moving toward the livery. We need horses, and your rifle, he added to Davis. To Lovely's surprise, the sheriff nodded and unstrapped his ammunition belt. Take mine. But I'm coming too, he said. This is still my jurisdiction. Within minutes, 3 horses were saddled. Lovely had exchanged her good dress for borrowed trousers from the stable master's wife, propriety forgotten, in the face of urgency. Around her wrist she had tied a red hair ribbon that had fallen from Neil's pocket that morning, a talisman connecting her to her son, when everything else seemed to be unraveling. As they mounted, Dr. Thompson handed Bear a small leather saddlebag. Medical supplies, he explained. Just in case. Bear accepted with a nod of thanks. They rode out of town at a gallop. Bear slightly ahead, his eyes already reading the trail in the dusty road leading north toward Crystal Creek. The sun was beginning its westward descent, casting long shadows across the landscape. They had perhaps 4 hours of daylight left. There, Bear pointed to fresh hoofprints and a partial footprint that could only belong to a child. They left the main road here. Sheriff Davis frowned. That's not the way to Crystal Creek. That trail leads up into the high country. Why would he take that route? Lovely asked, fear constricting her throat. Bear studied the tracks with growing concern. These prints show the horses are moving faster now. And look, he indicated where the smaller prints dragged slightly. Neil tried to slow down or stop. You think the boy's resisting? Davis asked. Or frightened? Bear replied grimly. Either way, Victor is forcing the pace. Lovely's hand went to the ribbon at her wrist, its soft fabric a poor substitute for her son's small hand. How long ago did they pass here? Bear's expression was grim as he remounted. Less than an hour, but there's a storm building in the mountains. If we lose daylight or the rain washes away their trail. He didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the stakes. Spurring their horses, they followed the tracks upward into increasingly rugged terrain, racing against the darkening sky and the distant rumble of thunder. The first heavy raindrops struck as they reached the ridge overlooking Serpent Canyon. Bear dismounted, kneeling to examine the increasingly muddy trail before the downpour erased it completely. They stopped here, he said, indicating a place where the horses had milled about. The boy's prints show he got down or fell. Lovely's heart clenched at the implication. Was he hurt? Bear shook his head. The prints are even. But look here. He pointed to a scuffed area. There was a struggle. Neil did not want to continue. There, Sheriff Davis surveyed the darkening landscape, his expression troubled. Why would Victor bring the boy into these mountains? The stage depot is east, not north. There, perhaps he never intended to reach it, Bear suggested grimly. A man desperate enough to kidnap a child might consider more permanent solutions to his problem. There, Victor wouldn't harm Neil, Lovely protested, though uncertainty crept into her voice. He's family. Family doesn't always mean safety, Bear replied quietly. A clap of thunder punctuated his words as the rain intensified. Bear quickly covered the clearest tracks with his hat, preserving them from the deluge while he studied their direction. There, he said finally, pointing toward a narrow trail leading into the canyon. They've left the main path, heading toward the old mining claims. Davis frowned. Those tunnels aren't safe. There was a collapse last spring. Few would follow. Ave remounted, following the treacherous path, single file, Bear in the lead. The rain had become a steady downpour, reducing visibility and turning the trail to slick mud. Lovely gripped her saddle horn with white knuckles, forcing down her fear to focus on the narrow path. The creek will be rising, Davis called over the storm. We need to hurry. They pushed forward until the trail narrowed dangerously, forcing them to continue on foot. Tethering the horses beneath a rocky overhang, they proceeded with Sheriff Davis's rifle at the ready, and Bear leading the way with unerring certainty despite the fading light. The entrance to the abandoned mine appeared suddenly, a dark moor in the canyon wall, partially obscured by fallen timber. Bear halted, raising his hand for silence. From within came the faint sound of voices, one high and frightened, the other lower and agitated. "They're inside," Bear whispered. Davis checked his rifle. "I'll go first." "No," Bear interrupted. "The acoustics will carry the sound of your approach. I can move more quietly." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "We'll follow after a count of 50. If you hear a shot, I won't need one," Davis replied with quiet certainty. Bear melted into the darkness of the tunnel with a silence that belied his size. Lovely began counting, each second stretching painfully as she imagined Neil alone and frightened in the darkness. At 43, a child's scream echoed from the tunnel, followed by a man's shout of alarm. Lovely bolted forward, Davis close behind her, propriety and caution forgotten in maternal panic. They rounded a bend to find an extraordinary tableau illuminated by Victor's fallen lantern. Neil stood pressed against the tunnel wall, eyes wide with terror. Beside him, Victor was frantically scrambling backward from the mouth of a side passage where rocks had begun to shift ominously. Bear stood halfway between them and the unstable section, his attention divided between the frightened boy and the imminent collapse. "The support beams are giving way," he called urgently. "We need to get out now." Victor lunged Niall, but the boy darted away, running toward Lovely with a cry of relief. She caught him in her arms, holding him tightly as Davis moved to cover their retreat. The sharp crack echoed through the tunnel as one of the main support timbers split. Bear shouted a warning as the ceiling began to give way. Victor, still closest to the failing section, stood frozen in panic. What happened next occurred so quickly it seemed almost a blur. Bear lunged forward, seizing Victor bodily and hurling him toward safety as tons of rock and earth crashed down. The rumble of the collapse drowned out all other sound, filling the tunnel with choking dust. When the dust cleared enough to see, Lovely gasped in horror. There lay half buried in debris, unmoving. Victor stared in shock at the man who had just saved his life. Bear," Neil cried, struggling against Lovely's grip. "He's breathing," the sheriff announced, with palpable relief. "But his leg is trapped." Best together, Davis and Victor, working with grudging coordination, managed to free Bear from the worst of the debris. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, but his pulse remained strong. "We need to get him out before the rest comes down," Davis ordered. With Victor supporting one side and Davis the other, they half-carried, half-dragged Bear's massive form toward the tunnel entrance. Lovely led the way with Neil's hand firmly in hers, holding the lantern to light their treacherous path. Without, the rain had slackened to a gentle patter. They laid Bear carefully on level ground, where Lovely immediately began examining his injuries using Dr. Thompson's medical supplies. "Why?" Victor finally asked, breaking the tense silence. "Why would he save me after what I did?" Davis gave him a hard look. "Because that's the kind of man he is, the kind you claimed he wasn't." Bear stirred, his eyes opening slowly to focus on Lovely's worried face. "Neil?" he asked immediately. "I'm here," the boy answered, moving to Neil beside him. "You saved Uncle Victor." Bear's gaze shifted to Victor, who stood awkwardly nearby, his fine clothes now muddied and torn. "Some debts can only be repaid one way," Bear said quietly. Victor looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "About many things." From his pocket, he withdrew a crumpled document, the guardianship petition that had driven their conflict. With deliberate movements, he tore it in half, then quarters. The torn legal papers scattered in the gentle breeze. The territorial court seal and official language rendered 6 months later. Spring brought new greenery to Redemption Creek. The bakery windows stood open to the fresh air, allowing the scent of fresh bread to mingle with the fragrance of lilacs blooming along the fence. Bear had built during the winter. Lovely arranged a tray of cinnamon rolls, smiling as she heard Neil's excited voice from the kitchen, where Bear was teaching him to carve a whistle from green willow. The boy's laughter, free and uninhibited, was perhaps the most precious fruit of all that had transpired since that stormy day in the mountains. On the bakery counter sat a hand-carved wooden sign, its surface polished to a warm glow, and its letters meticulously inlaid with contrasting wood. Mitchell and William's Family Bakery. Bear had presented it to her on their wedding day, 3 months prior. A simple ceremony in Dr. Thompson's parlor with the doctor, Sheriff Davis, and a surprisingly supportive Reverend Walsh as witnesses. The transformation in the town's attitude had not happened overnight, nor was it yet complete. Some residents still crossed the street rather than greet Bear directly. Others maintained a polite but distant acceptance. But gradually, encounter by encounter, the extraordinary man Lovely had married was becoming known for himself rather than the fears he represented. Sheriff Davis had been instrumental in that change, publicly acknowledging Bear's bravery in the mine and appointing him as a deputy for special cases involving the nearby Apache bands. Thompson had formalized their long-standing collaboration, listing Bear as his official assistant in herbal medicine. Most surprising had been Victor's transformation. After his return to Philadelphia, a detailed accounting of the Mitchell inheritance had arrived, along with legal documents establishing Neil's future claim to his father's investments, to be managed jointly by Lovely and Bear until the boy's 21st birthday. The bell above the door jingled, announcing Mrs. Pearson's arrival for her daily bread. "Good morning, Lovely," she greeted with a warmth that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "Those cinnamon rolls look divine." "Fresh from the oven," Lovely replied. Neil helped with the frosting. "Speaking of Neil," Mrs. Pearson said, lowering her voice conspiratorial, "Emma tells me he's the best in their reading group. Says he knows all sorts of words the other children don't." Lovely smiled, knowing the source of Neil's expanded vocabulary. Each evening Bear read to him from the books that now filled a new shelf in their expanded living quarters behind the bakery. Everything from Shakespeare to natural philosophy to Apache legends he had translated himself. "Bear believes strongly in education," Lovely said simply. Mrs. Pearson nodded, accepting the package of bread. "Well, whatever he's doing, it's working. That boy is growing up fine." After she left, Lovely carried a plate of rolls to the kitchen, pausing in the doorway to observe the scene before her. Bear sat at the table, his large hands guiding Neil's smaller ones as they worked on the whistle. The contrast between them, Bear's weathered copper skin against Neil's paler tone, had once seemed to symbolize their differences. Now it represented the beautiful complexity of the family they had formed. "Is it done yet?" Neil asked, impatiently. "Patience," Bear replied with gentle firmness. "A good whistle, like a good man, cannot be rushed into being." Neil sighed dramatically, but continued the careful work. "Will you teach me to track deer this summer like you promised?" "If your mother agrees," Bear said, glancing up to meet Lovely's eyes with a smile that still made her heart quicken. "His mother agrees," she said, setting down the plate of rolls, "as long as his reading lessons continue as well." Later, as afternoon shadows lengthened, Lovely stood at the front window watching Bear and Neil in the small garden behind the bakery. They were building a trellis for the sweet peas she planned to plant. Neil handing tools to Bear with solemn importance, asking endless questions that received thoughtful answers. Sheriff Davis stopped beside her on his afternoon rounds, following her gaze. "Quite a change from last year," he observed. "In many ways," Lovely agreed. "Town council's been talking about expanding the school," Davis mentioned casually. "Thought Bear might have some ideas about teaching the children about local plants and such. If he's interested." The offer, a public acknowledgement of Bear's knowledge and worth, was not made lightly. Lovely knew how far the sheriff had come from his initial distrust. "I think he might be," she replied. "I'll ask him." Davis nodded and continued on his round. Through the window, Lovely watched as Neil climbed onto Bear's shoulders to secure the top of the trellis, their teamwork seamless and natural. The journey to this moment had not been easy. There had been pain, prejudice and fear to overcome, some from outside, some from within their own hearts. But standing here now, watching the two people she loved most in the world building something together, Lovely knew with bone-deep certainty that every step had been worth taking. Outside, a commotion drew her attention. Another child, the new blacksmith's daughter, had gotten stuck in the branches of the old oak tree. Without hesitation, Bear set Neil down and moved toward the gathering crowd, his purpose clear. Lovely grabbed her shawl and hurried outside to join him. As they approached the tree together, the frightened child's mother looked to them with desperate hope, rather than suspicion. Bear assessed the situation quickly, then turned to Lovely with a question in his eyes. She nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. "I'll steady the trunk," she said. "You climb." Together, they moved forward to help. No longer outsiders but essential threads in the fabric of Redemption Creek, a family forged not by blood alone but by choice, courage, and love that had proven stronger than prejudice. Red, meaningless by this simple human gesture of surrender,